We all have culture. We're using language. We have beliefs. We have religions. We have science, you know.
That we're not a purebred species. We're really just sort of a mongrel species.
They walk upright. Maybe they have tools also. Maybe they're making something that is cultural in that way. Maybe they're part of a story like the Neanderthals are part of a story.
What we're now finding is that we're not that separate from the world. We're not that special.
남아프리카 공화국 요하네스버그. 한때는 인종차별의 상징이었지만 지금은 남아프리카의 금융을 이끄는 최대 도시입니다. 여느 발전된 도시와 다를 바 없는 이곳에서 북쪽으로 50km 차를 달리자 인류 화석 유적지가 모습을 드러냅니다. 인류의 요람이라 불리는 곳. 미국 지리학협회의 탐험가이자 남아공의 인류학자 리버거 교수는 이 초원에서 발굴팀을 이끌고 있습니다. 고인류학의 별이라 불리는 호모 날레디의 흔적을 찾기 위해서입니다. 리버거 교수가 발견한 화석과 뼈는 미국 위스콘신 대학교에서도 찾아볼 수 있습니다. 2013년 리버거 교수와 함께 호모 날레디의 화석과 뼈를 발견한 존 호크 교수. 그는 남아공에서 발굴된 뼈를 좀 더 정밀하게 살펴보기 위해 이곳으로 가져와 연구 중입니다. 호모 날레디. 과연 그는 누구이며 어떤 이야기를 품고 있을까요? 23만 년쯤 생존했던 것으로 추정되는 이 고인류는 어디에서도 본 적이 없던 새로운 종이었습니다. 오스트랄로피테쿠스의 특징과 현 인류의 특징을 모두 가지고 있는 이 뼈의 주인. 오늘 이 두 석학들과 함께 그 비밀을 엿보려 합니다. (700만 년) 전 인류의 조상이 최초로 삶의 터전으로 삼은 아프리카. 인간의 역사가 시작되고 진화에 대한 생각이 싹튼 곳입니다.
So we're above the rising star cave system right now. 3.5 kilometers of caves sit underneath this dolomitic limestone. This is a very ancient rock, almost 3 billion years old. It was formed on the base of very shallow, warm water seas near the origins of planet Earth itself, 4.5 billion years ago. This area is known as the Cradle of Humankind. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And within these rocks are found the many caves that hold the fossils of ancient human relatives and animal life that lived over the last several million years in this region. It's remarkable to say that this area has produced more evidence about human origins on the continent of Africa than any other place. And in fact, the richest site on the continent of Africa is right beneath my feet.
수백만 년 전의 비밀을 찾는 일은 결코 쉬운 일이 아닙니다. 고인류학자들 사이에서는 천운이 따라야 한다고까지 합니다. 남아공의 고인류학자 리버거 교수는 2013년 깊은 동굴에서 고인류학사의 남을 뼈를 발견했습니다. 동료 탐험가 스티븐 페드로가 보여준 한 장의 사진에서 시작된 모험이었죠.
Well, The moment that I first saw the images of these fossils was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. When Steve and Pedro opened up the computer and turned it on, and I saw these images of fossils that were clearly human relatives, but very primitive, just lying on the floor of the cave. I'd never seen anything like that. It was totally unexpected. That, of course, would lead to launching the Rising Star expedition. Just a month later, just a month after seeing those images, we put over 60 people in the field here, and very quickly we realized that the images I saw, which I thought were just a single skeleton, were actually part of a huge assemblage of fossils. In fact, the largest deposit of ancient human relatives ever discovered on the continent of Africa.
고인류학계의 이목이 집중된 현장은 몸을 굽혀야 들어갈 수 있을 정도의 동굴. 미로처럼 복잡하게 얽혀있는 동굴 내부는 상상을 초월하는 공간이었습니다. 곧 문제가 발생했죠.
Those bones we could see from photographs looked like bones of human relatives of some kind. And we were super interested. And yet, none of us on the collaboration side could fit into the chamber where these bones were. The chamber was very, very narrow, the entrance to reach. And so Lee recruited a team of scientists, people who are PhD students in archaeology, who were able to work inside the cave and to squeeze through the very narrow space and work inside on these bones.
So when I first crawled into this cave system, it takes about 45 minutes to get to where the first big constraint is, what we call the chute. It's 18 centimeters wide. And imagine this, you're 20 meters underground already, and you look down this 18 centimeter slot. That itself goes 12 meters down into the naledi chamber. When I first stared down that chute, I knew that it was going to be one of the greatest challenges any paleoanthropologist had ever faced, to actually figure out how we were going to do this. I needed the right kind of people not only with the skills to work down there, that were willing to risk their lives to go down there, but also that had the physical ability to go through a slot this wide.
리버거 교수는 페이스북을 통해 발굴에 합류할 팀원을 공개 모집했습니다. 이 파격적인 실험에 전 세계 60여 명의 전문가들이 지원을 했고 6명의 여성 과학자가 선발됐습니다. 20cm도 안 되는 좁은 동굴을 지날 수 있는 작은 체구. 동굴 탐험과 등반 이력, 고인류 지식을 갖춘 전문가들이었습니다.
It's good enough, yeah. Got a bit of a tangle, but I'll sort that out just now.
깊은 동굴에서 뼈를 발굴하는 일은 새로운 도전의 연속이었습니다. 동굴 안에 인터넷도 설치해야 했습니다. (30m) 지하에 있는 발굴팀과 의사소통을 하고 발굴 과정을 실시간으로 지켜볼 수 있도록 카메라와 인터폰도 설치했습니다. 기존의 발굴 관행을 깬 모든 과정은 실험적이고 실용적이었습니다. 한 사람만 겨우 지날 수 있는 좁은 동굴. 리버거 팀은 사다리를 놓고 통로를 만들었습니다. 사다리를 타고 내려가면 본격적인 동굴 탐험이 시작됩니다. 지름이 25cm 정도 되는 비좁은 통로. 이 통로를 지나기 위해서는 배를 바닥에 대고 한 팔을 머리 위로 올린 채 다른 팔은 몸에 붙여서 기어가야 합니다.
But it takes almost 30 or 40 minutes to travel that 130 meters. Very tight passages where you have to crawl. One of them is called Superman crawl, where you have to stick your arm over your head to slide through it.
이런 자세로 기어가다 보면 폐쇄공포증을 느낄 때도 있습니다. 슈퍼맨 기어가기가 끝나면 이번에는 용의 등이라는 공간이 기다리고 있습니다. 울퉁불퉁 가파른 바위가 용의 등처럼 이어져서 용의 등이라고 불리는 이곳. 몸에 밧줄을 묶고 조심해서 20m를 등반해야 합니다. 라이징 스타 동굴에서는 모든 과학자들이 탐험가가 됩니다. 슛은 동굴 탐험의 마지막 관문으로 폭 18cm, 높이 12m의 좁은 수직 구멍입니다. 그 아래에서는 인류 역사의 위대한 순간을 만날 수 있죠. 동굴의 30m 아래 깊은 방에는 화석이 된 고인류의 뼈 1,500여 점이 놓여 있었습니다. 그동안 어느 고인류학자도 보지 못했던 고인류의 비밀스러운 공간을 발견한 것이죠.
That moment when those fossils first came out was an incredibly emotional moment. Firstly, this is a very dangerous environment. And we'd set up an environment and a system that no paleoanthropologist had ever worked in before. We didn't know whether the communication would work. We didn't know whether our methods for excavation would work. And we didn't know what we were really finding there. So when those first bits came up, people had risked their lives to bring them out. And the emotion that they were real, that they really were an ancient human relative, and they were in this extraordinary circumstance, it's hard to describe. It was one of the most amazing moments of my entire life, and I think probably for everyone there.
It was such a surprise to us because from the photographs that we had from the cave, we thought maybe this is one skeleton. Maybe, that would be exciting, so exciting, because something like Lucy, right, a famous skeleton and with many parts, and we thought this is what we would find. And immediately our team was underground and they were bringing out pieces, and we saw that there were the same piece many times, and we knew that there were many skeletons, and that was amazing. What was even more amazing is that when the different parts were coming, we could see that the different parts didn't match our idea of any hominin ancestor or relative. And so we were discovering something that none of us had ever seen before.
Wow, you was some kind of a shocking and exciting at the moment.
At the moment it was exciting, but it was also puzzling. We didn't understand, right? We expected we would find something that was already known. And it would be exciting because we would have better skeletal evidence, right? But what we were puzzled by, what made it strange, is that the different parts didn't seem to go together the way we expected. The bones are complete bodies. In the second chamber, the sedi chamber, we have a skeleton that we've called neo. It is most of a skeleton of Homo naledi. It is an incredible discovery.
열정과 끈기가 만들어낸 기적 같은 일. 그런데 이런 기적은 리버버 교수에게 처음이 아니었습니다. 실제로 인류 역사에서 위대한 발견은 종종 우연한 순간에 이루어졌습니다. 2008년, 초원에서 놀던 한 소년의 눈에 띈 것은 단순한 돌이 아니었습니다. 고인류의 쇄골뼈 화석이었습니다.
So back in 2008, I was conducting a survey using Google Earth in this region. And I was using Google Earth to actually discover caves just like this one. One of those caves that I discovered on August the 1st of 2008 was right next to where I'd spent 17 years working. I didn't know it existed. I went back there on August 15th with my then 9-year-old son, Matthew, my dog, Tal. And about a minute and a half after arriving at the site, we were looking for fossils, and Matthew said, "Dad, I found a fossil." As I started walking towards him, I realized that he was holding a block of rock with a clavicle in it. This bone right here, it's your collarbone. And I immediately knew what it was because I'd actually done my PhD on the bones of the whole shoulder girdle, including clavicle, one of the rarest bones that we'd ever found. There were just a few that had ever been found before. I couldn't believe it. That would lead to the discovery that that was part of a partial skeleton, and in fact, a partial skeleton that was there at the site with many other skeletons. We would eventually name it Australopithecus sediba, an extraordinary discovery.
200여만 년 전 아프리카에 살았을 것으로 추정되는 오스트랄로피테쿠스 세디바. 세디바는 호모 날레디처럼 다양한 조합을 가지고 있었습니다. 오스트랄로피테쿠스에 속했지만 손과 발, 턱뼈의 모습은 전혀 달랐습니다.
So one of the big questions with Australopithecus sediba is how does it fit into the human family tree? We don't know is the honest answer. It'd be very easy for me to start claiming, well, it's the ancestor of things like Homo habilis and maybe even the ancestor of things like Homo naledi. It's a very advanced Australopithecine and would make a good candidate for that. But I think the better lesson about sediba is that maybe we shouldn't be asking the question of where all these things exactly fit, because the story's not about trees or ladders, that we understand the general tempo or mode and tempo of human origins by seeing things like sediba. And we understand where human origins has progressed through that, but we don't know exactly where sediba fits within the family tree. But that's also true of most of the other discoveries. Human evolution is not a simple story.
미국 위스콘신 대학교 메디슨 캠퍼스. 존 호크스 교수는 이곳에서 매일 뼈를 들여다봅니다. 이곳에 없는 뼈도 3D 프린터만 있으면 출력해 연구할 수 있습니다. 전 세계에 있는 학교나 대학에 있는 자료와 비교 연구가 가능한 거죠. 매일 들여다보는 다양한 종류의 뼈와 화석들. 하지만 그가 가장 좋아하는 뼈는 바로 이 호모 날레디의 뼈입니다. 20만 년 전 고인류의 뼈는 오늘날까지 남아 많은 이야기들을 들려줍니다. 뼈의 각 부분들은 서로 다른 이야기를 담고 있죠.
Naledi's skull, to start with, it's small compared to ours, right? It's a third the size of my brain, this Naledi brain. It's got a brow ridge in front of its orbits, and that brow ridge is very different from humans, similar to ancient species like Homo erectus. Its face is small, and its teeth, even though the teeth have a primitive appearance to them, its teeth are small and human-like in size. That means they're probably working like human teeth. They're eating a human-like diet in some ways. Its jaw has no chin. Our jaw has a chin. This mandibular symphysis here, the middle of the jaw, is sort of vertical and a little bit more human-like than species like Homo erectus. It's an odd set of traits. It's not characteristic of anything that we've discovered before. And that's naledi. It's always something different, even in the same part of the body.
두개골은 확실히 사람과 생김새가 확연히 달라 보입니다. 하지만 손은 차이를 잘 모르겠습니다. 존 호크스 교수의 설명을 들어볼까요?
Yeah. So if we take a look at this hand, I'll tell you that the wrist bones of Homo naledi, they're almost exactly like human wrist bones. And it's really interesting, actually, because there's a little bone here, the trapezoid, that in naledi is shaped like a human, and in apes and Australopithecus, it's very different. So it's got a human-like wrist. Its thumb is long and strong. Its fingertips are very broad, and that means that it's able to grip onto things with some force, right? So that's a tool-making hand. But at the same time, its finger bones are very curved. And that curvature means that they're able to grip onto branches and hold on to them very well, right? That curvature develops by them gripping on like that. That's a very primitive-like thing. Our hands are not like that. So you have this combination of traits, human-like traits that seem to be linked to tool making and climbing traits.
그렇다면 다리는 어떨까요? 존 호크스 교수는 이 다리뼈가 가장 멋진 부분이라고 이야기하는데요.
This is a shin bone. This is a tibia. And it's long, right? So this is a human-like tibia. And in fact, it overlaps with humans in size. They're tall, not as tall as tall people. They're about 140, 150 centimeters tall. So relatively short, but in human body size. And their tibia are very thin. They're long and thin legs, so they're sort of small, they're slight. Their foot, entirely human. This is a human foot. It would fit inside of a size 4 US shoe. So you're talking about a foot that has an arch like a human foot. You can see it here. You can see the arch of this foot, right? It's just like ours. And that's naledi. You look at parts of it and you say, this could be a human. And you look at other parts and say, that's human-like, but it's very different, right? It's strange. And you look at some other parts and you say, this is like nothing I've ever seen before. This is totally new.
호모 날레디에 대한 비밀이 모두 밝혀진 건 아니지만 지금까지 드러난 것만으로도 우리는 많은 걸 상상할 수 있습니다. 뼈의 주인인 호모 날레디는 수십만 년 전의 인류로 추정되는 지금까지의 종들과는 다른 새로운 종이었습니다. 치아와 어깨뼈는 원시적인 특징을 띠고 있었지만 신체의 중심에서 먼 부분들은 현생 인류와 비슷한 특징을 보였습니다. 약간 휜 손으로는 도구를 쥐었을 겁니다. 긴 다리, 현생 인류와 유사한 발로 직립보행을 했을 것입니다. 호모 날레디가 언어를 사용했는지는 조금 의문입니다. 현 인류의 3분의 1에 불과한 작은 뇌 용량과 구강 구조가 말해주죠. 뼈는 호모 날레디 자신에 대한 가장 확실한 증거입니다. 하지만 뼈가 모든 것을 이야기해주진 않습니다. 호모 날레디가 발견된 장소가 중요한 이유죠. 남아프리카 초원 30m 지하에는 오늘도 고인류 뼈 조각의 베일을 벗기는 작업이 한창입니다.
So we're just checking how's it going down there?
Yeah, pretty well. As you can see on the monitor, Becca's working away. We've got quite a bit of bone exposed at the moment, but we're not sure that anything is going to sort of come up right away today.
이 동굴 밑바닥엔 아직도 호모 날레디의 뼈들이 수천 점 이상 남아있을 것으로 추정됩니다. 깊은 동굴 속 밑바닥의 방에서 무더기로 발견된 호모 날레디. 이 사실로부터 알 수 있는 건 호모 날레디의 생각입니다.
So one of the most controversial things about Homo naledi is that we don't know why they're in these various chambers deep underground. After eliminating all of the probable causes, they'd been swept in there by a flood or a carnivore had killed them and dragged them in there, we came to the conclusion, after we eliminated those things, that Homo naledi must have been deliberately disposing of its dead. Now, remember, Homo naledi has a brain the size of an orange. It's just bigger than my fist. We have big brains, and we think about our own mortality. We think about death, and we go through very elaborate, ritualized processes when people die as humans. It's, in fact, the thing that almost defines us as humans. But if Homo naledi was doing that, it means that they may have had a level of consciousness, at least in that area, that was close to ours or equal to ours. That's very surprising with a small brain, and it would certainly be the first time we've met another species that isn't close to us that had that level of consciousness, and that's remarkable.
수백 년 동안 묻혀있다 등장한 날레디는 진화에 대한 생각을 깼습니다. 인류의 신장이 계속 커졌다는 이론을 뒤집었고, 뇌가 점점 크게 진화했다는 이론 역시 날레디의 작은 뇌로는 설명되지 않습니다. 수십만 년 동안 빛을 보지 못하다가 인류 앞에 나타난 날레디는 인류 진화에 대해 새로운 물음과 과제를 던집니다. (1856년) 독일 네안데르 계곡. 계곡 근처 동굴에서 신원미상의 백골이 발견됐습니다. 사망한 지 너무 오래돼 화석으로 변해 있었죠. 인간이 가장 완벽한 존재라고 믿었던 당시 사람들은 납작한 뼈의 주인이 곰일 수는 있어도 옛사람이라고는 생각지 못했습니다.
So there's a great question about what is the definition of being a human? And I think we struggle with that because there's no real simple definition. That's particularly true when we start finding near fossil relatives like Neanderthals, which are they a different species or are they an extension of this? But the simplest definition is all of the variation that we see in every living human on the planet today. That morphological variation, that behavioral variation, and that genetic variation. That defines what it means to be a living human.
그로부터 2년 후, 찰스 다윈이 진화론을 발표하면서 인간과 다른 종의 존재가 인정받기 시작했습니다. 네안데르 계곡에서 발견된 뼈도 사람의 뼈에 속한다는 주장이 제기됐고, 계곡의 이름을 따서 네안데르탈인이라고 불리게 됐습니다. (50만 년) 전부터 (3만 년) 전까지 살다가 사라진 네안데르탈인은 어떤 모습일까요? 캐주얼한 정장이 잘 어울리는 신사. 어딘가에서 우리와 공존하고 있을 것 같은 이미지입니다.
We have in our genomes 20,000 genes that do different things. And from Neanderthals, we've gotten something like 2.5%, 3%, maybe some people even more, maybe 4%. From Denisovans, another group of people, there are humans that have gotten maybe 5% of these genes, right? Most of our genetics come from Africa. A small amount come from these other populations. And even in Africa, there are some small amounts that have come from more ancient groups of people. We know that we're this product of mixture, and we want to know, what does it mean? Sometimes it means nothing. We can't tell what these genes do. Maybe there's just no functional difference. It's just a sign that we have a connection.
So one of the great mysteries that Homo naledi poses is what's its relationship with living humans, if it has a relationship with living humans? Well, we know by its morphology that it's primitive within our genus. It's primitive within our lineage. So could it be the source of our entire lineage? Could it be the source instead of something like Homo habilis or early Homo erectus? That's a real possibility. When you do comparative studies, in fact, Homo naledi looks to be an equally probable ancestor of modern humans as Homo erectus does. But it's very young in time. Now, does that mean it excludes itself from being the ancestors of humans because we believe that modern humans were arising at that same time? The answer is no, because that's not when Homo naledi began. Homo naledi may have begun millions of years earlier. In fact, it probably did. So actually, the lineage could have given rise to modern humans. Or could Homo naledi have interbred with living humans? We're here in southern Africa. When Homo sapiens around 250 or 300,000 years ago, we believe was rising here in southern Africa. What would have happened if they met Homo naledi? Could we possibly be carrying some Homo naledi genes in us? We don't have the answers to that, and that's only going to be answered if, at some point in the future, we find Homo naledi ancient DNA. And that'll answer all the questions about its relationship. Right now, we know it's an ancient human relative.
나무 위에서 살아가는 영장류. 한때 인간이 원숭이의 자손이라는 생각이 오랫동안 지배했었습니다. 물론 지금은 낡은 생각에 불과합니다. 인류가 나뭇가지처럼 복잡하게 갈라지며 현재에 이르렀다는 생각은 수많은 오늘이 반복되고 나서야 가능했습니다. 그러나 영원한 정답은 없는 법이죠. 호모 날레디의 발견으로 인류의 진화가 정해진 순서와 방향에 따라 이루어진 것이 아닐지도 모른다는 생각이 싹트기 시작했습니다.
Until things like Homo naledi were found, most people, and I think many scientists, thought that the story of human origins was very simple. It was just this gradual evolution. You've even probably seen T-shirts that had that kind of picture of the evolution of humankind. What Homo naledi says is it's much more complex than that. There's no linear evolution of humans, that it's more like a braided stream where things would diverge, but sometimes parts of them would come back, and that we're not a purebred species. We're really just sort of a mongrel species made up of lots of different species that have existed in the past, lots of different experiments, and here we exist today. And Homo naledi demonstrate that our ancestry, our evolution was extremely complex and very diverse.
When we look at people today, humans today, right? We all walk upright, we all have large brains, we all talk to each other, we all have culture, we're using language, we have beliefs, we have religions, we have science, we have lots and lots of things that we think of as human. When we look at the fossil record, we look at these ancient human species, and we find that they share some parts of that. They walk upright. Maybe they have tools also. Maybe they're making something that is cultural in that way. Maybe they care about each other. Maybe they're finding social connections in a way that humans do. As anthropologists, we look at that record and we say the things that we find to be human are not all together. They've come in pieces to us. Maybe they're part of a story like the Neanderthals are part of a story. Maybe we find that traits are mixed up in the skeleton because they're mixing. We don't know the answer. If we ever get DNA from Naledi, I expect it's going to tell us a big story. So far, we have no DNA.
유일하게 현존하는 인류, 호모 사피엔스. 우리는 모두 고인류의 후손들입니다. 어쩌면 호모 나델리의 유전자 역시 우리 속에 일부 남아있을지 모르죠. 3만 년 전까지 우리의 조상들과 함께 지구 어딘가를 거닐었을 그들. 그들의 실체를 찾아간 여정은 우리의 진정한 모습을 찾아가는 이야기였습니다. 진화를 생각합니다. 인류 진화의 역사에 등장했다가 사라진 수많은 존재들. 현재 우리의 삶에 영향을 준 존재는 어떤 존재들일까요? 우리가 걷어내야 할 또 다른 편견과 환상은 무엇일까요? 우리는 어디쯤에 있는 것일까요?
If you imagine a glacier up at the top of a mountain valley, and down at the bottom there's this tremendous lake. Imagine if that lake was the 7+ billion human beings on the planet. And that glacier is melting, and those rivulets of water are actually our ancient relatives. There's sort of a main tendency in the central stream. That's our main lineage. But sometimes you'll see one species that breaks off and disappears in the gravel and doesn't contribute to that big lake. Other times, a rivulet might break away and then come back and rejoin us a little bit, and that water becomes part of us. So I think the braided stream is a better model of human origins than a ladder or a bush or a tree.
인류 진화의 비밀을 풀기 위한 탐험. 때로는 목숨을 걸어야 했습니다. 화석화된 뼈는 우리에게 단편적인 이야기만을 들려줍니다. 하지만 그 이야기들이 모이자 인류 진화에 대한 이야기는 매우 복잡한 양상을 띠기 시작했죠. 진화는 직선이 아니다. 이 사실은 조금 철학적인 질문을 던지게 합니다. 사람을 사람이게 하는 것은 무엇인가라는 질문이죠.
What does it mean that we share some of our DNA with this other ancient group of people? It means that when these ancient groups came into contact, even though they had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years and had become quite different from each other, they still were able to breed. They still recognized each other as people, as mates. They didn't see each other as something that was totally different. And I think that we have so much to learn from that. Because when we look at people around the world today, you look at people and you say, these people are very different. But they're not genetically very different. We're all very similar to each other. In some traits, you look at someone, maybe they're different skin color, maybe there's a difference to the way that their face is shaped, but the genetics is so similar. And yet, whenever we meet each other, even if there are struggles, we still can fall in love, we still have relationships that are friendly, we still have that potential. For humans, this is all cultural, and we recognize things that are similar in people even when we see that they're different.
So I think that when human beings looked at ourselves prior to the invention of science even, we saw ourselves as different from the world, as separate from the world. We were different than animals. And almost all the religious texts, almost all the philosophical texts try to explain why we're different. What we as paleoanthropologists have been finding over the last 150 years is first we found that there were forms that were close to us in the past, but weren't us. Things like Neanderthals, but even earlier, things like Australopithecines, more primitive members of our own genus even. What we're now finding is that we're not that separate from the world. We're not that special. We've now seen that animals use tools. We see that animals mourn. We see that certain types of birds almost create adornment in their nests and things like that. And now we're finding creatures like Homo naledi, who may be equally complex to us, but just in a very different way. And I think that humans now have to accept that we're not very separate from the natural world. We're just part of it. And that's what we paleoanthropologists are finding.
So the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site was proclaimed more than 15 years ago. And it was proclaimed because of all the history of the very rich finds of human ancestors that were made in this region from these Dolomitic caves. At that time, we thought there were about 14 important sites. We now know that there are hundreds. Many of them, like the Rising Star site, which we're standing at today, are brand new. They were just discovered several years ago. There's plenty more to be discovered here, though.
So we will continue the work at Malapa, where Australopithecus sediba came from, and we're finding new fossils all the time there, almost weekly. We're finding new sediba fossils. We're continuing the work here in the Rising Star Cave system, and there are thousands of remains that we've discovered here. This journey will go on not just for years, but decades, if not hundreds of years into the future. We've continued to explore, and we have found new sites, literally hundreds of fossil-bearing sites in this region. Some of them have new hominid fossils in them, and we'll be opening those excavations up. So it's going to be a very exciting next few years for paleoanthropology, with all the great discoveries coming out here and elsewhere on the continent of Africa.
And so for us, this is as big a question as it is for anyone. How can we look for 80 years in a place and still find something very new that we never found before? It tells us that we have not looked hard enough. We're going to find more things when we look more, when we're exploring more, and we look in caves in other parts of the world, we're going to find new things that we did not expect before. This is a lesson that anthropologists have been learning with cave discoveries like Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, new species in a cave on Flores, very different from other hominins, and only lived maybe 60,000, 100,000 years ago. In Siberia, there's Denisova Cave, which has DNA evidence of a branch of humans, Denisovans, that existed before 50,000 years ago that we never knew about. We're making these discoveries. And I think that we are just exploring and we're finding that there was more in the past than we thought there was. We're finding new things that we didn't expect.
Personally, are you still, going to the Tanzania and then, discovering new things, right?
So my research is, yes, I have totally dedicated myself to finding new things, to continuing to explore. And we're working in South Africa on new sites. We're also looking to work in other places. And for me, it is about getting the public engaged in this. It is about getting people to know that the next discovery could be in their backyard. The next discovery could be something that you know about that no one else maybe has seen.
일상에서 의식하지 못한 채 지나치는 것들이 있습니다. 나 자신, 가족, 인류의 기원에 관한 것들이죠. 고인류의 뼈는 그에 대한 질문을 쏟아냅니다. 질문에 대한 답을 찾는 과정에서 우리는 스스로의 고정관념이나 편견을 마주하기도 하죠. 화석이 된 뼈가 현대를 살아가는 우리에게 갖는 의미입니다. 인간이 지나온 오랜 여정. 당시의 세계를 이해하는 것은 지금의 세계를 이해하는 또 하나의 방법입니다. 그리고 그건 우리의 미래에 대한 단서이기도 합니다. 우리는 어디에서 왔고 또 어디로 향하게 될까요? 오늘도 고인류학자들은 그 흔적을 쫓아 인류의 요람으로 향합니다.
언제